Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Peter Murray, I'm Curator-in-Chief at NLA, or New London Architecture, and we're a think tank and network with a mission to bring people together to shape a better city. And I'm delighted to welcome you today to this event on the new geography of cities, which is from the British Library here in London. Today we're delighted to bring together urban thinkers and place shapers to discuss about how cities are changing as a result of the pandemic. Londoners, like many around the world, have been spending more time at home, rediscovering their local neighbourhoods, shops and amenities. Yet at the same time, this has placed great strain on London's central activity zone, with its rich and sometimes conflicting mix of residential, commercial, tourism and leisure activities. Today we want to explore the changing geography of cities, how London is known as a city of villages, and the pandemic has, with working from home, really brought that concept to the fore. The London we know today developed naturally with many smaller centres, with the City of London and Westminster at its core, and the ancient towns and villages growing to form one large and untidy metropolis. Places like Chelsea and Kilburn, Brixton and Croydon, Wandsworth and Hampstead retained their distinct identities, but were absorbed into the administrative conglomeration of the County of London first, and then now the Greater London Authority, which is run under the elected mayor, Sadiq Khan. Over the past decade, significant changes have taken place as the centre has spread outwards. The high cost of accommodation has made outer areas more attractive places to live, while infrastructure investment has transformed the viability of new developments. Thus, today we see major growth and densification taking place in the outer areas. Although the centre remains the economic driver of the capital, and indeed of the United Kingdom, developments with a focus on neighbourhoods, on placemaking, and a reduction in commuting have become increasingly significant in recent years, and COVID has accelerated that, with local economies benefiting from more people staying at home rather than commuting into the core. A many-centred or polycentric city provides places where people can work, live and play. And in his policy document, A City for All Londoners, which was published now some 5 years ago, and which formed the basis of his new London plan, Sadiq Khan, as Mayor of London, set out his thinking about good growth, which he said requires planning that intensifies and maximises mixed-use development while retaining the character of existing communities. This was written well before the idea of the 15-minute city caught the imagination of mayors around the world. But it illustrates how COVID has accelerated those changes, many that were already taking place. London, as a polycentric city, a feature that, as I said, is derived from its historic structure, as well as its distaste for grand plans, has an inbuilt resilience to the challenges that face us in the post-COVID era. So, although it is perhaps the relationship between the core, so essential to London's role as a global city, and the outer areas that is so critical at the present time. So I'd like to ask our expert panellists whether they agree that polycentricity is the key to London's resilience and its future success. And our speakers today are Yolande Barnes, Chair of the Bartlett Real Estate Institute at the University College London, Tony Travers, Director of LSE London, a department of the London School of Economics, and HANNA, Master Plan Strategist for Global Developers Lend Lease. So, Yolande, perhaps I can start with you. So, I know you've talked much about and you were the first person I heard saying this, about the acceleration of things that were happening as a result of COVID. So, Are you seeing a speeding up of what you've talked about before, the moving out to the suburbs and indeed beyond London as a result of the pandemic?
Absolutely. As you say, and the simple answer to your question about is London's resilience about the polycentric city, I think the simple answer is yes. And was already proving to be, because before COVID, global cities were already changing. And I think we're only at the foothills of the sort of changes that we're going to be seeing in the geography of cities. But the sort of things that we were looking at was primarily the result of the fourth industrial revolution, the digitization or digital economy. Now, what that was starting to mean was that the old drivers of the geography of cities, or what we thought were the drivers, started to become less important. And you could see this particularly in digital industries, where the global competition for digital natives, the tech talent, meant that cities became a way of competing in the jobs market for this scarce resource. And what started to matter more and more was the quality of life, and by life I include work, that these millennials and Gen Z workers were looking for. So we started to notice in commercial real estate, for example, that people wanting to relocate, companies wanting to relocate, were actually asking not what building should I be in, but what city should I be in, and particularly in which neighbourhood in that city should I be. And we were finding that parts of the city with human scale, often traditional streetscapes, and sometimes heritage quarters, not always, but very often, were starting to take on a premium that had never been seen before. So the difference in rents between, for example, the City of London, the financial centre, the sort of district that we'd have put the highest value on in the previous century, we found the fringe areas of that part of the city were actually achieving rents on a par with the financial centre. So that was changing, if you like, the bid rent, and really challenging that very centric sort of view of the city. And we were finding that new neighbourhoods out in the east, creative quarters like Hackney Wick, or new tech hubs like Richmond, were starting to become part, much more of what was considered, if you like, centre city. So the distinction between centre and outskirts had started to diminish pre-COVID. And then we find, of course, like any other pandemic, real estate is always changed by pandemics, dating from the Black Death and the rise of the yeoman farmers to public health crises like cholera, or the issues around the health and nutrition of soldiers in the First World War, leading to major change. So this catalyst or accelerant nature of COVID, I think, is just that. But what we have to think very clearly about is not sort of pre and post-COVID. And I think there's a lot of thinking that thinks that we're just going to return back to normal after COVID, but rather see COVID as part of this train of the digital transformation of the city, of which we're really at the very start. So I think we're already seeing, in retailing, what started, if you like, as digitization in the 1990s, which was the replacement of mail order catalogues with Amazon or other internet shopping, then it became digitalization. So it started then, having sort of digitized the shopping world. Digitalization, as it were, started to change behaviour, and we started to shop more online. That, of course, has been massively accelerated by COVID. And so now I think digital transformation is possible, where it actually changes the nature of the thing itself. And what we mean by shopping is probably something quite different, and going to be something quite different in 20 years' time. We're still in that evolution. And I think if you think about what's happened to retail and all the impacts that's had on high streets and main streets, and indeed the West End, the centre of London, and indeed other global cities have experienced the same sort of thing. What we're looking at is trying to think about what does digital transformation look like? What happens when people start doing things digitally that they used to do in an analog way? And what we find is that actually when you've got access to everything everywhere and anything anywhere on your handheld device, what matters is the face-to-face interactions, the human face-to-face interactions, the serendipitous meetings, all those things that we come to the city for, the being able to accelerate by exposure to all the different cultural and other offerings that cities have to have. That's what is driving the city now. And that means a different type of environment, I think, to the one we've been building for the last 20, 30 years or so. Because it means a much finer grain and much, much more multi-use approach to things. So this domination of the asset class, the so-called planning classes the world over, simply reflect global investment classes, in my view. And the domination of these single-use sort of big block, big buildings, single-use on big grids, is being replaced by a much more complex, multi-layered, multifaceted, changing on a daily, even hourly sort of basis type of co-working, co-living, co-everything else space. So I think we've got to replace those big old asset classes with a much more human-centred city that looks at live, work, play, but also stay, make, visit, learn. All those things that we do in a city has to be considered, I think, in a much more holistic way. And we can't rely on those sort of top-down predict and provide sort of ways of organising the city. And so it's a fine-grained, multi-layered, sort of multi-use city, polycentric city, I think, that we're looking at in future.
Thanks, Yolanda. So, Tony, in this digital world, and during COVID, the central activity zone has clearly been suffering. What do you think there's changes that are needed to keep that essential part of the global city going?
Well, it is a very big test for agglomeration economics. Remember, there was a lot of work put into trying to measure the productivity gains that came from dense cities and city centres. It's worth remembering that whilst the use of the underground public transport in London has got nowhere near back to the levels, or indeed it hasn't in New York either, of pre-pandemic, in many other cities it has. So this isn't, it's not going to be exactly the same in all cities around the world. And I think the issues thrown up by the pandemic point to me to the challenge facing policymakers, that is politicians, who can send out signals via their tax policy, via their planning policies and so on, have to think a little bit about what they really want to come out of all of this, remembering that for many, many years they've been sort of they have believed in city centre density. I mean, the Crossrail will open next year, whose entire business case, an east-west railway in London, was on the assumption of further increases in employment in central London. And that takes you immediately into thinking about what does all this mean for the balance between public transport and the car. So I take Yolanda's point about the sort of Los Angelesification, in my word, of what London might be like in future. And London, interestingly, was always capable of being more of a dense city like New York or Paris, or more of a sprawling city like Los Angeles. But the inevitable consequence of this kind of city as described, if it turns out like that, will be more people travel by car and fewer by public transport, which is a long way from where public policy was aiming 2 years ago. So we have to think about not only that kind of issue with its environmental consequences, but also about the ecosystem of the central area. Because, I mean, 50, to use an obvious example, not saying this will happen, but 50 theatres spread out over the wider southeast, so London and its region, would not work as well as 50 in one place in the middle of the city. So there's quite a lot of things we need to begin to think about, and certainly policymakers need to think about, as to what they're prepared to allow to happen and what they're going to use the policy levers at their disposal to try to constrain or direct what occurs as a result of all of this. I can easily see, and I mean, quite a lot of people will choose and have, although the data are pretty ropey at the moment, to move out, to buy more space. But that means less space for everybody else in total, must do. And it also means that people who are better off with particular kinds of jobs can volunteer for this new world, but many others are not mobile like that, and their jobs can't move. So there are equity considerations as well. So, of course, to some degree, London, like all cities, is the product of property development, market forces, people's choice, and. But government and policy has an influence on the way that will turn out. And so my sort of simple message would be, we need to, policymakers and government and those who talk to them, need to think long and hard about what would be a reasonable outcome or what would not be a reasonable outcome, and then to have the data that allows us to see what's happening, and therefore to advise politicians what signals to send in planning systems, transport fares, you name it, road usage charging, as to what kind of city they want to emerge from all of this. Because otherwise, my guess is, given that London, it's worth remembering, London has seen people moving out net for decades, every year. So the pattern is people move from London, usually just outside, and then people move in from the rest of the world. And that has, in recent years, with the natural change in the population, led to an increase in population. That leads to sprawl already, and as I say, I think that deciding how much of that politicians want in a relatively small country like Britain is now primary function of government.
And so, Kat, you're involved with High Speed 2, which is a development around High Speed 2, which is a new fast train system coming into London. Now, we talk a lot about the 15-minute city. Is the 15-minute city and the, might say, 1-hour commute city, can they coexist?
Absolutely, I think so. And I think, it's probably just worth thinking a bit about, and it's good to see Tony, I think, bring up the role of transport in all of this, because obviously it's about the transport network that is obviously enabled to really facilitate people moving around the city, and the city, as it changes. Because I think what we've talked about so far is we've kind of talked about polycentric in two ways. There's been kind of an economic centre or not, and having multiple economic centres, or actually more in a sense of kind of neighbourhoods. And I think what we've probably seen traditionally is economically, London hasn't been massively polycentric. It has very much been driven by the CAZ, by the Central Activities Zone, facilitated very much by radial transport. That is kind of lines, taking you in right into the centre. And I think that is going to, that's going to remain to be hugely important. But actually, residentially, we have also got this network of neighbourhoods, not necessarily particularly well connected orbitally, as anyone who lives in, say, somewhere like southeast London, trying to get to West London, will tell you, can often be quite challenging. But have actually, I think, as we've said, particularly what the pandemic has shown us is that reliance on that radial network actually isn't necessarily as important as we need it to be, at least not 5 days a week. Those neighbourhoods have been able to thrive in their own right. Those people that were previously getting on the train every day aren't needing to do so, and people are feeling, hey, my neighbourhood can actually work quite well for me as a place to be all the time. But I think it's worth saying that's not every neighbourhood, and that's not the same for every person. I think Tony mentioned that point of equity. And we should remember, there was a very good stat that came out, from the United States, I'm not sure of the UK equivalent, but actually the percentage of those who did not have a high school diploma working from home in the States was around 5%. It was incredibly low. A lot of people, in the cities rely on people who do still need to go to specific locations for their work. Similarly, this idea of the 15-minute neighbourhood is underpinned by a whole network of logistics. We've all been living these sort of concierge lifestyles where we're loving going to the local butcher, baker, candlestick maker, but actually we've also been using Amazon a lot, well, at least I think quite a lot of us have. So this idea of actually almost what the shadow network of the city is underneath that 15-minute neighbourhood is also really important to think of as well. So I think going back to this question of, how can we have this balance of the two? Well, I think the answer is we do need it, because the question is you do need that scale. I think going back to Tony's point about theatres, when you have a lot of theatres and that concentration of location, you can cater to different niches, to different audiences, because you've got that overall size of audience. And similarly, when you're looking about talent, when it comes to specific businesses, when you're looking at an economy that's increasingly about bringing together people from different sectors, different types of skill sets, different parts of the world, and actually combining their ideas intellectually, again, that point of scale and the breadth of that network is really important as well. And that's why connections like HS2, do start becoming really important to being allowed to enable that. I think my concern sometimes is that we get very focused on the sort of, pop-up bike lanes and we're all going for brunch in our local neighbourhood on a Tuesday. And it's wonderful, it's great. But actually there are a lot of people for whom that has not been their experience. So it's how is the city going to work for those people, as well as those of us who have had, I guess, what you could call in many ways a quote-unquote good pandemic. So I think that's really what policymakers and also actually any type of person involved in city shaping needs to be thinking about.
So we still need an efficient public transport network to provide access to jobs for people who need to actually travel to work, who can't actually work from home, don't we?
Absolutely, there's that. And I think it's also about giving people the choice that, I think it's hard to highlight just quite how new this experiment in working from home is. In the UK in particular, it's not something many of us ever did regularly before the pandemic. And then more or less overnight, we were all doing it. So, I think we're still very much in those early days about what the return to work is going to look like. I think anyone that tells you any certainty, we're going to go back to 9 to 5, it's going to be hybrid, it'll be 2 days, 3 days, they often don't necessarily know, or they're potentially pushing an agenda. And I think we've seen a fair amount of that over the past few months. So I think I would caution, it is early days with that. It's also going to differ, from city to city, different sectors as well. New York's gone for the quite American, get back into the office now. More companies in the UK have gone for a bit more of a, wouldn't mind, if you wouldn't awfully mind coming back into the office, that would be greatly appreciated. But again, we're going to have to see how people adapt to that. I think we all know personally, a lot of people are enjoying getting back in and doing that face interaction, and public transport is going to be hugely important for that.
Thanks. Tony?
Yeah, well, certainly at a personal level, I've noticed as something like normal life has got back post-lockdown, I've made more contacts in the last 3 or 4 weeks than I did in the 18 months before, and I'm just conscious of that at a personal level. But building on Kat's point, because commuting times in London are amongst the longest of any city in the world, and the particular way in which public transport is paid for, which is more by fares than elsewhere, there are very powerful incentives for people not to travel to work. You can save thousands of pounds a year by working from home. It's a pay rise. But that's not true for the people who make the city function, who are often coming in on a bus at 5 in the morning, 4 in the morning, who are still paying their fares. So, I do think that, as going back to the point I was making, building on what Kat said, is that policymakers need to understand what all these impacts are in order that they can either say, yeah, we are going to go along with this, and we're going to try and mitigate any of the downsides that come with it, and then take advantage of advantages where they occur, and there will be some. It does give greater opportunities to places outside the city centre, though my guess is most of the places that will do best are places that were quite well positioned already, and there are plenty of places in outer London that have not benefited from the last 30 years of economic growth, and which actually need huge investment now, and I doubt somehow it'll be them that benefits.
Yes, but we have to take into account in London another thing, which for those non-UK people in the audience, is that the present government has the idea it needs to rebalance our very centrist economy, and that will have an impact on the way that London is funded and infrastructure is delivered, won't it, Tony?
Well, certainly that's the signal the UK government is currently sending out, and there are an enormous number of pots of money being put up now for trying to help places that have been so-called left behind, so they can catch up with London and the South East. But my point, the one I've just made, remains. London is the largest concentration of deprived people in the United Kingdom, and public policy, as always in cities, because cities all big cities in the world have this big gap between the very rich and the very poor. And imagining that the very rich are, in a sense, the typical London or the typical of any city, whereas all the other people also need help levelling up. My own view is levelling up should be about people and households, not about regions. And, you know, public policy risks got quite close to effectively saying that poor people in London should be a bit poorer in order that not so poor people in the rest of the UK are a bit richer. Well, that wouldn't make much sense, would it? And in fairness, I doubt the government really wants to do that, but there's just a risk it can end up like that.
So, Yolande, you talked about people moving out of London. So, will London grow as a city, do you think, or are we in for a period of degrowth?
Well, London was already losing population in all age groups before the pandemic. It was only international in migration pre-Brexit that was keeping it growing. Paris has seen an absolute decline in population. So I think, you know, we've got so used to thinking over the last few decades about London just sucking in all the talent, all the capital, you know, almost everything, and we forget that actually the city ebbs and flows. That there have been periods where that hasn't been the case, and I think the so-called levelling up agenda reflects perhaps that sort of idea. But again, you know, these are things that were already in train. There were obscure little towns and other cities all around Britain. Places like, I don't know, Glossop or Hebden Bridge or Margate that was suddenly enjoying a renaissance. And it's almost as if London's an idea that has spread out, which also speaks to that inequality thing, that there's maybe more important is the divide, the so-called culture wars in the country, where we think of London in terms of one group of people who actually have spread out to all these other sort of, it's insulting to call Bristol a mini London, but an alternative London, you know, an alternative. So the future is very much urban. You know, I'm very optimistic for the future of urban settlements. And indeed, I think there's been a laziness in our commentary around this in talking about the flight post-COVID to the suburbs. It's not suburban flight. It's maybe suburban-ish sort of town centres, but it's much more complex than that. And there are still some places that are not favoured by that group of people. So it's very difficult not to talk at cross purposes, and I was conscious of this when we're talking about, are we talking about polycentric city, Los Angeles, that's almost impossible to say. Sorry. Or the rise of neighbourhoods. I think it's the latter. It's the rise of neighbourhoods. The neighbourhood has never been more important, whether it's an isolated kind of rural neighbourhood or one of London's famed sort of urban villages. I don't think we're talking about anything like LA, because LA is about physical sport, physical extension. You know, either I haven't got the memo, or but as far as I'm aware, you know, the green belt's still pretty much intact. So I think physically London's constrained and not going to sprawl physically. And I think actually the extension into the suburbs, potentially the polycentric city, means a densification of neighbourhoods in the suburbs.
But Yolande, but I'm not, because a lot of people do move out of London. It's true, there is a green belt around London protecting it from development, but they soon can arrive in places just on the edge or outside the green belt, which have always continued to grow. And you know, thinking of London as only the 9 million people inside Greater London is, you know, my economic geographer colleagues have always thought about it as the wider southeast. So 25 million people within an hour and a half of central London. And as I say, the people who've moved out every year, and there are people have always net moved out of London, and then they move in from the rest of the world. And with natural growth, the population since the 80s has grown. We'll see what happens, you know, in the next 3 or 4 years. But you can see from the centres of towns not far from London, like Reading and and sort of Basingstoke, which have long had pressure of people moving out, and Aylesbury needing to expand. So they won't build on the green belt, it's just that the city will expand a bit further into the outer metropolitan area. Now, it's not quite like Los Angeles, but I do assure you it will mean more people travel by car than by public transport if it goes on like that.
But then people will still be commuting into the centre, will they not? And what do you think, Tony, then, of the future of the office in the centre? I mean, presumably, all the benefits of agglomeration not only operate within the sort of wider central city itself, but also within offices themselves. And aren't people going to be attracted back into the centre?
I mean, it isn't, it's a cliche to use the word an ecosystem, but it is an ecosystem, central London. And what I suspect will happen, and Kat's absolutely right, nobody really knows, is that there will be fewer people who permanently go back to work. But that will liberate space, and then new businesses and people who like the city can replace those who didn't like it so much. And that ecosystem, London's, and Yolanda mentioned this, faced plagues and cholera epidemics and wars and terrorism, on and off since the 13th, well, before even the 13th century, and has eventually pulled back. So that's what I think will probably, and actually if you go out there now in central London, there are huge numbers of new businesses opening up. Older ones have died. Some of them, and I'm not belittling people who've lost their jobs, but there will have been a clear out of businesses, and lots of new ones, which couldn't afford to be here before, will now be able to set up. So I think there'll be a sorting, redistribution of people and businesses, and 20 years from now, 30 years, we'll know what happened.
So as an urban strategy at Lend-Lease, which has a lot of office space, both in London and indeed around the world, what's the sort of thinking about the office space and what sort of offices people will be looking for?
Yeah. I think the common expectation is around this idea of the flight to quality. It is, I think it's now, the ship has sailed when it comes to the idea of presenteeism, that to be a good employee, you have to be in the office all the time. So it has to then be about the sense of, well, why would people go into the office? And it needs to really be about, well, what do I get at the office and I'm not going to get at home, particularly, as Tony said, if you've got that particularly long commute. Where that gets quite difficult is actually, as we've all learned from the pandemic and the many Zoom calls, no doubt, people's home setup differ quite differently. So, for example, it's not unsurprising that a lot of younger employees have been quite keen to get back into the office, because if you're trying to work from home with 3 other people around a shared kitchen table, it's not particularly ideal. Similarly, I think we've seen the same from colleagues who have 3 young children at home. They're quite keen to get back to the office too. For others, they found actually they like working from home, but when it comes to, say, collaboration or specific project meetings, that proximity, that creativity, that serendipity that we've mentioned is really important. I think the other thing from a Lend-Lease perspective, we probably emphasise and we're thinking about is this isn't just confined to the office building, and I think we've seen, as well as this quite binary, you're either working from home or you're working from the office. We're seeing this third category emerge, and it was already happening pre-pandemic of what I guess we could kind of call work from anywhere. That could be a coffee shop, it could be the British Library here, it's an incredibly popular location here for people to come and work. So actually, what are those spaces as well where people might come in, might be for between meetings, it could be half a day. Again, it's all about also, it could be cultural and civic spaces as well. And I think this then goes back to the idea of, I think, Yolanda's point about neighbourhoods and actually what makes a resilient neighbourhood. And what the pandemic has really shown us is areas that were more mixed in terms of land use before fared better. It's not massively surprisingly. Areas like the City of London that weren't particularly mixed, that had really a negligible residential population, didn't fare particularly well. Footfall fell off a cliff more or less overnight, and obviously the businesses that relied on that, have been severely impacted. So those, again, and those suburban neighbourhoods, or even sort of slightly zone 2, zone 3 neighbourhoods that have thrived throughout the pandemic, have been those that have been able to support a range of activities. Some of them have had co-working spaces, they've had cafes, they've had cultural facilities and shops. And again, we do need to forget, there are actually a lot of neighbourhoods that don't have that are actually almost kind of singular land use in terms of residential. So I think if we're looking as developers, what's the big takeaway from this? It is really that importance of the mix of uses, the importance of flexibility and adaptability. I think this is one challenge we will see certainly with some stock in the city, people saying, we should retrofit, turn it into homes, do it all overnight. Even if that was what you wanted to do, it's not going to be straightforward. And again, if we look at London's history, the neighbourhoods that have been able to adapt are those that have that housing stock that can adapt, or that building stock. Places like Soho in the West End have actually changed all the time between office, between home, between places to visit, between restaurants. And I think it's that idea that really gives us the resilience.
I think that's true, but that very mix also caused conflict. I mean, if you look at Westminster, which is right in the heart of the West End of London, and with the theatres, restaurants, all that sort of thing, but it also has a lot of residents, and actually recovery is being hampered, I think, by this conflict between the amenities and the residents. Soho, for instance, had great restaurants out in the streets during COVID. They've all gone now because the residents don't like the noise and the interruption that creates. So mix is not always good, is it, Tony? I mean, you live right in the heart of London, don't you? So
yeah, I mean, well, and indeed, the lockdown was fascinating in that regard because it did go quiet, and it was like, Christmas all the time, so very strange. And I've rather, welcomed the noise back personally, but that's a curiosity of me. But the truth is that I think, if you look at the point you're making slightly the other way around, which is that if in some of the neighbourhoods which it is hoped might benefit from permanent home working, have more people living there all the time, they will want development less than they did before if people are there during the day. And one of the things you notice if you work at home during the day is that building sites work all day. And I certainly noticed that during the lockdown. So, as with everything, nothing is a panacea. So people working from home, I totally take Yolanda's part. It was happening before the pandemic, and it was a phenomenon like shopping online that was just being given a push fast. I read the other day that Britain now has the largest distribution of parcels in the world, so that means lots more white vans on the streets. And I just think that, as I've said 3 times already, so I'll say it a fourth, as with all of these things, we need good information about what's happening so that policymakers can they have agency in delivering different kinds of recovery from the pandemic. And thus, the more information they have, the better advised they are by my colleagues here, then the more likely they are to make wise decisions.
Great, thank you very much. Well, before we finish, you said a very nice thing, which I liked. London is an idea which has spread. So perhaps I can ask all 3 of you and start with you. Just what is the idea? I mean, how do you describe the idea of London?
Oh gosh, it's about the ultimate in civilization and interaction, isn't it? I mean, cities are the driver of civilization, and I actually don't think we need backward-looking sort of evidence. We do need more thought about what sort of future we want. And even the domesticisation of the workplace, for example, maybe we should be thinking more about living at work than working at home, for example. So thinking about new and different ways of doing all the human activity that human beings do.
Tony, what's your idea of London?
Well, I think London, Yolanda's got. I mean, it is an incredibly creative, exciting place, which I think puts quite a lot of people off, by the way. I mean, it's a horses for courses issue, this. It attracts some people and repels others, so we mustn't pretend everybody likes big city downtowns or indeed, increasingly active suburban parts of cities. So, but I think what it is, it's a place where opportunity. You can go and be yourself with the cloak of anonymity and try stuff out.
I think I'd add to that. Really, it's London's diversity, its sheer mix of people and activities. Whether that's reflected, in its food. Where I've spent during lockdown a lot of time in Victoria Park, my local park. You go there and you see again the range of activities that happen there, the range of communities, and I think that is quite unique to London. It's actually not just that mix, but the shared spaces that we inhabit as well, and all the connections that encourages.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we're up to time, so thank you very much to our speakers. And the NLA will follow up this discussion about resilience of our neighbourhoods and high streets with some upcoming research on local London. So we're launching that soon, so keep an eye on our website, nla.london, for more updates on that. And I think it's very interesting when I look back at how things are accelerating through COVID. Cedric Price, that great architectural thinker, once described the evolution of cities as a series of eggs. Boiled eggs were sort of hard on the outside with a central core. fried egg had a centre, but with a low and flowing outer city, but the future city is really a scrambled egg where everything is spread out across the area of the urban context. So thank you to our speakers again, and thank you very much.